pigs that are violently disrupting business today. And I think the morning was a great introduction to understanding some of them. I'm going to race you through what I think they are in my own way. And then I'm going to spin it and flip it and actually show you less about how serious you should be as the brand marketer, communications person, technologist in the room, but really what you do in terms of looking from the perspective of that customer. So the first little pig is to transform. I jokingly tell people that you cannot throw a marketing professional down a flight of stairs these days without hearing the words marketing. This is business digital transformation tumbling out of their mouth, right? Like everyone's trying to figure out what is business transformation, what does it mean, how do you transform? And the more simplistic way that I'm explaining it to a lot of brands and businesses, and by the way, this is sort of where I spend a lot of my time. I run this agency now called Mirium. It used to be an agency called Twist Image that was acquired by WPP 2 years ago. And then we took a bunch of agencies that were acquired through the J. Walter Thompson organization, brought them together and launched Mirium a year ago, which is about 2,600 people, 20 plus countries, global agency. So I spend my time with large clients, B2B, B2C, some small, some medium size as well, speaking about this world, and a lot of them talking about business transformation, how they're going to do this. I believe that transformation actually happens one place first, and that's in your internal organization. And that it's very hard for you to project the spirit of business transformation if you yourself are running your businesses on BlackBerry and Lotus Notes, if you know what I'm saying. And you see this a lot where people think they're being all that transformative, but they themselves aren't leveraging the tools within their organization to actually help them actually transform and communicate and connect to customers. So you have this first little pig, which is how do you, one, transform? The second little pig is how do you innovate? And this is also an area that very much gets sort of under my skin. We were having lunch and talking about this amongst some of the speakers and guests here. And there's this idea that the best way to innovate in marketing today is to create a better mousetrap. So instead of doing a TV commercial, we're going to do a viral video on YouTube, and that's the way we're going to innovate. And I actually don't believe that to be true. I think what digital has done to marketing enables you to do things in which you could never have done before through these digital channels. So when I talk about to innovate from a marketing perspective, I'm not talking about better, clever, more impressive advertising. What I'm actually talking about is something I explain to people as digital grilled cheese sandwiches. What do I mean by that? We were acquired by J. Walter Thompson Corporation, JWT. This is an agency that's been around 150 years, one of the oldest ad agencies, first ever hired a female creative director, first TV ad, blah, blah, blah. There's this legendary tale, and I don't know if it's true or not, I've only been around about 2 years, that Kraft went to JWT with these cute little square processed cheese pieces of orange, I guess it's food, we'll call it food. And they said to them, we want you, JWT, to come back to us with a really catchy campaign ad. You got to frame yourself back in this time, right? Like this is sort of this is the time when we were putting out ads that said things like 9 out of 10 doctors recommend Marlboro cigarettes. Like it was crazy back then. It wasn't even like transparency that you could forget about, right? And so the story goes that JWT came back to Kraft with this idea for the grilled cheese sandwich, right? We're going to take 2 pieces of white bread that all these good American people are eating. We're going to take these American singles or Kraft singles that live outside of the U.S. and we're going to put them between, lather with butter, put on a nice frying pan. It's a fantastic, delicious treat we're going to have. And you all know what happened. It worked pretty well. We still eat them today. Some of us still actually do it as kids. That's the sort of thing that we do. And if you were to modernize that and think, what's a modern version of a grilled cheese sandwich? I would argue that actually, I think iTunes is a great example of a digital grilled cheese sandwich. It's a new product or service that's introduced that leverages the legacy line of whatever it is they're creating, whether it's computers, tablets, phones, watches, it doesn't matter. And they're also creating, through this new product or service that is digital, a way to communicate, to connect. They're creating new revenue streams, and it's very, very dynamic if you actually start peeling beneath it. And so you can look at any sort of component within your organization and see opportunities where you don't just have to advertise a new product or service. You could use digital to actually be the product or service, or you could add in a product or service on top of what it is you're trying to release to sort of push things forward. So to me, that's innovation, the second little pig. The third little pig is to transact. Now, I'm very tempted as a digital guy to put e-commerce there, but like e-commerce to me feels really old after 15, 20 years of being in marketing. And I also think that e-commerce, as a general sort of halo, is very highly misinterpreted by most brands today. Brands say, look, this is great, e-commerce is fantastic, but like 0.5% of the people who come to our site convert. You've heard all these data points, right? Yes? It's not working. So what happens here is that what brands don't realize is that That's the macro conversion, right? Getting people to actually buy things. There's tons of these micro conversions, as my friend Avinash Kaushik, who's the analytics or digital marketing evangelist at Google, a friend of mine, talks about. And if you look at things like, what are my micro conversions that actually lead to that macro conversion? They buy from me, or even if you don't have e-commerce, they order from me, or they engage with me. There's many. I think a transaction is someone giving you their email address. I think a transaction is someone watching one of your videos. I think a transaction is you have more information than you did before, besides just blasting a message out into the world where you don't even know if they have the impression or not. And we started seeing a lot of very interesting pieces of data come together and we start analyzing things. So one of my favorite stories is I was in New York doing an event for Google, and they brought in their 300 largest education clients. So places like Columbia and Phoenix and all the other bigger educational facilities that advertise with them. And my buddy Avinash had done this test. And so what's the macro conversion? What's the e-commerce? What's the ordering on a education? So someone registers, right, for a course or for a program. And what he did is he realized that it's interesting that somebody comes onto the site, watches the video, and then signs up for the newsletter. There's like an 80+% chance for this site of getting the macro conversion. But if you look to see where the spend was happening, it was nowhere near there. They weren't paying attention to the video that they just posted once, and they really weren't doing all that much dynamic with the newsletter. That's a fascinating thing that we look at transactions typically as this big thing that they finally buy from us, when in reality the transactions are minor and small. Now, if you take these three little pigs and look at them, you have one, the ability to create this sort of disruption, if you will, right? This ability to change. That's actually an internal function. Number two is to innovate. The innovation part is what the customer actually sees. And number three, the transaction part, that's actually what they do. They can do something now. And it may seem simplistic to you, but it's actually pretty dramatic to think as marketing, brand, communication leaders, you can have input into all these different components, where before we just put a message out there, hope the salespeople did their job, and then hope that somewhere down the line you can validate why you spent all that money. Now that is the true, real transformation. That is the real disruption that's happened. I think marketers and brand leaders have really done a really poor job of embracing the whole spectrum of things that they can do. But remember, we're here to talk about this consumer. So what happens is when I talk about those three little pigs, people go, oh my God, like how are we ever going to do this? This seems like insurmountable. And the truth is it's very, very large and hard to do. So what I try and tell people is it's actually little things. If you look at it from the perspective of the customer, it's actually these little nuanced things that consumers have done that have changed the way they interact with them. So what do I mean by that? How many of you know what this is? Raise your hand. Okay, good. I always do this as a sort of litmus test because I can tell you something. I live a fascinating life. I was doing a conference for them with very senior leaders, 300 very big sort of corporate type clients. And I asked people in the room how many of them knew what this is, and very few of them did. And then just that same day, I jetted back home. I live in Montreal. I was at McGill University speaking at their MBA program. I asked the students, like, how many of you know what this is? And they all raised their hands as if I was also the old guy in the room. You know what I mean? So it was really interesting to go from those two types of audiences and get to know you guys know that this is Snapchat. Snapchat is the ability for you and I to agree that we're going to connect. And if I send you an image or a video, you're going to look at that video, and once you see it, it disappears, unless you're the NSA, then we can talk about that on another session. Now, we know Snapchat, and a lot of you are raising your hands because of the growth and popularity that it's been experiencing. But I go back to when I first started hearing about Snapchat in 2012 to a moment in 2013 when this happened. So this happens in 2013, and basically, I don't know if you remember this moment in time, but when I heard this news, the left side of my body started going numb. I had this sensation that I could smell and taste burnt toast. I was literally stroking out. I couldn't believe this because Snapchat was so new, they had so few employees. There really was no revenue stream. There wasn't even video on Snapchat at the time. And Facebook comes in and says, we want to buy you for $3 billion, and they go, no, we're good. Now, how many of you have a 20, 25-year-old daughter or son, and or you are an uncle or aunt to a 20 or 25? Most of us have this type of age group in our lives. And, you know, we'll do supper, let's say a Friday night. And imagine, I come home from supper on Friday night, and my 25-year-old son or daughter is there, and I go, how did it work going with your cute little startup Snapchat, great friends? And they go, Dad, you're not going to believe this. Facebook came to acquire us. You'd be like, this is the greatest day ever. And then they're like, we said no. And you're like, you said no? What was it? Was it not enough money? No, they offered us $3 billion. Now, again, I live in Canada. I'm pretty familiar with our laws down there. I'm pretty sure some might be familiar with the child abuse laws up here in the U.S. too, but We'd have some stocks being thrown at us, right? Like, we have to admit that this is a crazy thing, right? And so you see this and you think this is absurd that at any point in time, any company like this would say no to that amount of money. But if I were to also say, you put on your marketing, communications, and brand and technology rates and tell me, who are the real winners online right now? Who are the winners who are really doing things with content in a dynamic way, a very sort of forward-thinking way? And I would say the brands that are really nailing this have three things going when it comes to the content side of it. One is it is purely image-based. And when I say image, it could be a photo, it could be a video, right? Two is we know it's what I would call mobile first. What does mobile first mean? Mobile first just means that the experience on your mobile device is better than it is on your desktop or PC. And so if you look at the things that are sort of booming around now, Snapchat would be one, Instagram could be another, Tinder, from what I'm told, would be another. I'm married, my wife doesn't let me date, she's fun. But we know that this is what works, right? So it's mobile first, so the mobile experience is better than the web experience. And then the third part is it's social. And when I say social, it's usually, well, viral. It's not viral. That's a great effect. Social is just whatever thing is being created, I create in a way where the hooks are built in that I can share it and talk about it in the easiest way possible. So would you agree with that? That sort of seems to be the best thing brands can do right now. And so if you think about that as a construct, and you go back to when they said, actually, no, here's what happened. Here's a sort of screenshot of the world. This is November 2013 photo sharing site. So see here that Facebook actually owns 43% of this market. Instagram owns 70%. Flickr, what happened to poor little Flickr? Remember Flickr? 1%. People used to come to me like, I've got a great idea for photos, and I was like, are you crazy? Flickr dominates. And it's like 2 minutes later, it's like, what happened to Flickr? And then you'll see here, 49% is actually Snapchat. Isn't that amazing? So we're sitting here and doing this uncomfortable laugh that Facebook and Snapchat couldn't get a deal done for $3 billion. And the truth is that Facebook knew for a paltry $3 billion, and I don't joke when I say that, but then they had massive war chest. This wouldn't be that massive an investment. They could have 100% dominated the exact space that we all agree is where the winners are today, three plus years later. And what's amazing about this is that if you fast forward to last week, this is what's happening. Snapchat introduces videos. Facebook has introduced videos. Facebook is doing about 8 billion video views every single day. Snapchat, as of last week, has 8 billion video views every single day. They've never matched them. Imagine had they actually done the acquisition, close to 20 billion video views a day just by Facebook. Now suddenly they're right in the crosshairs of brands like YouTube and Google and things like that. And so before you ask yourself, well, did Snapchat make a mistake? Or are they the future of digital? I want to circle back to this idea of the three little pigs and these nuanced little changes that your customers are making. Because if you think about it, Snapchat introduced something very, very dynamic in me that most people don't even talk about, and all of their crazy growth and the excitement that we all have about it. So back in 2012, Snapchat comes out, and I look at it and I'm like, this is really weird. I sent a picture to you, you look at it and it disappeared. What's the point? But what I realized is that what Snapchat had done in a very small, nuanced ways, they've introduced a new way in which people communicate online. They introduced something I called back in 2012 the impermanent internet. Now, what does that mean? Right? It means that suddenly Snapchat becomes very replicative of the conversations we have in our day-to-day lives. I was watching all of you here and out there. Some of you were taking selfies and posting to Twitter, fantastic. But the vast majority of the conversations that we had and interactions we had are recorded and then uploaded onto the internet. And Snapchat just introduced this sort of seamless habit that people have to naturally communicate with each other without having the archive of it. Now, why is this unique? Well, in this room, we are the ones who are going to brands every single day saying, get online, get a website, get on social media, do all this stuff. Why? Because the internet and Google is like an elephant. It never forgets. And if you as a brand are not online, whatever someone searched for, whether it's in a generic search like on Google or in a social space like Twitter, where you ask them, hey, is this brand any good? Whatever comes back is the first brand impression, right? If positive, negative, or neutral, that's the brand impression. That is what it is. And yet, in a small, nuanced way, Snapchat introduced an entirely normal way that we communicate into the digital construct of it, and it's changed the consumers in a very, very powerful way. And so to sort of start thinking about things, like what's another thing that happened in a small, nuanced way for consumers, ownership became a very big thing in this past short little while. How many of you have a setup like this at home? You're like laughing because you're like, I moved that to the basement. Or you're laughing because you're like, I've already moved that into boxes. It was not that long ago that Blu-ray came out, and you're like, I just bought the entire Star Wars trilogy on DVD, and now I have to buy it all on Blu-ray, thanks, right? And then it switches in a very, very quick way, and suddenly we have streaming. And streaming comes in, and we go, sure, Netflix, no problem, $7, $8, $9 a month, at least everybody's streaming, they'll look great. But there are subtleties underneath it that I don't think we understand that have dramatically changed the way consumers interact with brands, and actually how they interact with buying things in general. So if you look at Netflix, here's what we know, right? Netflix has 75+ million subscribers. We know that 10 billion hours are being streamed by every single month. But here's the big thing about Netflix: no more hard drives. You used to download movies legally or otherwise, and it would fill up your hard drive, and then you take the jump drive and put it on that and have them there, and then you bought the big, bigger, extra portable hard drives and you put them there, and you're like, this is too stressful. I'll take an old computer and I'll leave it in my home and I'll make it like a media center, and we use Wi-Fi to connect it, right? It's crazy. And then suddenly this thing comes along and poof, no more hard drives, right? And then one more thing happens that's very, very dramatic. How many of you remember this? On a Friday night, you go home, you have dinner with your family, and then in the middle of the winter, you get in your car and you drive to the video store, you go up and down the aisles of the video store, there were no yellow or red tags, and you go home with nothing. I'm sure last night, many of you were in bed at your laptops and Netflix on, looking at the selection and going, I don't even know what to choose, there's so much good stuff to watch here. You have analysis paralysis. But what's happening from a small consumer way is that suddenly, as a consumer, you're recognizing the amazing power that you have when you're paying for access over ownership. And you're seeing this in music streaming services and beyond and beyond. And there are many instances where this is becoming pretty dramatic. And if you start looking at it even from music streaming services, you can see how much this is impacting. So this piece of data came out while Apple was still testing the subscriptions for their Apple Music service. So this is before the 3-month or whatever it was. We now know, I think it's 15 to 20 million people that subscribe to Apple Music. But look at what's going on here. You already have music streaming services surpassing physical formats. So what's going on here is consumers have become amazingly great at actually paying for access over ownership. And again, it's easy to look at that and go, well, that's no big deal. And I actually think it's a huge deal. Where I want to end is sort of on a thought for you to have as you move through the next couple of days and today, is we tend to look at this stuff and think it's complex, it's technology, it's business disruption, it's marketing. I actually think we've had a massive inflection point. And the massive inflection point is this, where technology has removed technology from technology. And that's been the biggest catalyst for brands and marketers, and this tremendous opportunity to connect with their consumers. What do I mean by that? So you've got some smartphones there. Where do you keep the instruction manual for your smartphone? Where do you keep that instruction manual? Really, there isn't one, Dolly. There's no instruction manual for this thing, right? You turn it on, it goes. My mother turned 75, we bought her an iPad, and I said, Mom, if you can't figure this out, we have to put you down. I've seen videos of cats on YouTube who know how to open the phone and find what they need, right? And so we're seeing this. And so that's the point, is technology has become so intuitive and so easy and natural to use, where these devices are everywhere and connected, that the opportunity is absolutely huge. The other part of it is that brands haven't caught up to how consumers are actually using them in a nuanced way. So this is stuff where we see the data and we go, yeah, we know this. We know that mobile is basically everything, and nobody really cares much for desktop PCs, let alone portable PCs, and now we're seeing a stagnation of tablets. And yet I bet if I took every single brand in this room and went on your site on my mobile device, I would be like pinching, and where is this stuff, and why is it there? And you're sitting there going, well, Mitch, we have a long IT roadmap, and it's like 9 months, or we don't have buy-in from mobile, it's hard to drive. I agree with all that, but the consumer has totally moved on. They've 100% completely moved on to that space. And so I think the big shift we're going to see this year is we're finally going to see, hopefully, brands realize that mobile cannot be a less than web experience. Mobile has to be the ultimate experience, and the web becomes the sort of add-on for it, because we're seeing that it's actually true. IDC reported that mobile is basically the primary device for most consumers, and that the PC is fundamentally relegated to an accessory device. This isn't new data. This came out in 2013, I think. And so the consumer has already decided, and the point is that it's actually not these massive changes that are fundamentally change the way you do it. It's not that. Consumers have adopted in a very small and nuanced way, a ton more financial dollars to this. And the problem is that we're sitting there waiting for them all to accumulate and wondering, what are we going to do about it? So before I leave, got a couple seconds here, I'm just going to walk you through a couple of these sort of final thoughts for you to think about as you go through today and tomorrow. One is that I would recommend that instead of just thinking about how much content you're creating to connect to the consumer, think about actually how you distribute that content. So one of the things you heard in the introduction is I've got this blog and podcast called 6 Pixels of Separation. It's hard to get people to come to it. So I do things like I speak at Brite, I publish in Harvard Business Review. I try and distribute my content in a way where I can get people to pay attention to me. But obviously for the content to work there, it has to be outside of my walled garden, and it has to be relevant to that audience. It can't be just about how great of an agency Mirium is and please come work with us. So you have to build that through real content. The next thing is think about that digital marketing innovation stuff, digital grocery sandwiches. How do you actually build not just campaigns, but is there a revenue stream here? So we're going e-commerce. We're going to sell the stuff we sell in our physical store and just ship it to you. Well, why? If you're doing that already, why not add in digital products and services that you can use to augment that to get people to be more engaged and connected to you? Back to this idea of mobile. People think mobile, web TV, terrible. I tell people it's the one-screen world. Screens are everywhere, they're connected, they're ubiquitous, that's it. You don't sit at home watching TV with your right eyeball on your Android device and your left eyeball on the TV. TV, nothing's good, I've got my device. The only screen that matters is the screen that's in front of me. And consumers move through that content, as we know, and brands, unfortunately, aren't. The last thing I would tell you is, it's funny, you're having this conversation at lunch, and I was like, that's my closing slide. We live in this crazy world where we make digital look like traditional media. And everything is like impression and GRP based. And Facebook is this big, and Instagram is this big, it's crazy. Facebook may be 5 billion people or whatever, 1.7 or whatever the number is, but the truth is it's a bunch of little things. It's a bunch of people like you are connected in a small way to your 1,000, 2,000 person network. And the true opportunity you have in digital is not to just pump out impressions, but to actually make an impression. And when you do that, you can be your own me. You can actually be awesome. So I know we have time for Q&A a little bit, or no, or we don't, or do we? Yes. We do, okay, great. So we do Q&A, but some people are shy, it's a big room. If you want all of my contact information, I just want everybody, this is all my contact information. My mobile phone is there, you can see pictures of me, everything is there, so just Google Mitch Joel, you'll find me. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you much.
How's the rhythm fit in? After the why?
What I hear of Algorhythm is actually that I think we are in this sort of world where people are looking at this idea of either you're data-driven or you're creative-driven. And when I'm on the data side, which I am, and as a digital guy, and I sit down and I talk, I get up on stage a lot, and I'll have a pair of food brands come up, or fully omni-channel, we're doing it. And then I talk and I think, show me an example. And it looks good on the slide, but they're actually really not doing all that, and they're actually trapped on the other side. And I look at this like if you can understand the flow and nuance of these consumers, you can have a world of both. And I think those two brands are really all work.
So the algo is the data, the rhythm is the creative. They
Exactly.
work together. Yeah. Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to the next book and diving into that. Let's we got time for questions from the audience.
I talk fast and panic.
Questions?
I'll answer the first question. Yes, there's like 40 other minutes that normally I present, but nothing.
I think you've wowed them. That's great. So Mitch is going to be here. You can grab him during the break if you want to ask him a question. And his book is at the table in the back. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mitch. All right. To introduce our next speaker, I'm going to hand things back to Michelle Fong, our Research Director of the Center on Global Brand Leadership. Michelle?
I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker for this afternoon. Professor Donna Hoffman is the Louis Rosenfeld Research Scholar at George Washington University in DC, where she's been for the last 2 or 3 years. Donna is a leading thinker and academic in the area of technology and consumer behavior and marketing. She was one of the forefront thinkers in terms of how to incorporate and do serious research on how the internet was changing consumption behavior and decision making. And lately she has been actually starting a new research project on trying to think about how the Internet of Things, the next big thing, is changing the world. And so she has been heavily involved not only in academia, and she was academic fellow of the Marketing Science Institute. She works a lot with the different corporations like Walmart, Lansand, FedEx, Microsoft, Intel, and so on and so forth. But I do not want to take any more time, and she's going to tell us more, again, about the next big thing, about the Internet of Things and what it implies for all of us. Please welcome Donna Hoffman.
back here. I used to be on the faculty at Columbia a long time ago, and it's a lot of fun to be back. And in fact, some of my former students are in the audience, so I'm not sure what that means, but that's pretty awesome. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk about the next phase of our research. I'm going to talk about how to market the smart home by focusing on emergent experience and not use cases. So I'm going to share some of the work, distilled some of the conceptual work we've been doing and some work we've been doing in our lab. And I want to start with this cartoon. So as you can see here, the husband says, we have to go out for dinner. The refrigerator isn't speaking to the stove. And his wife looks a little perplexed, and it's kind of funny, but this cartoon is actually pretty deep because it suggests that the smart home is going to be something much more than we expect it to be. And that's really the motivation for what I want to talk to you about this afternoon. So here's my agenda, and those who know me know that I have a really hard time condensing a lot of things into a very short period of time, so I'm going to do my best to get this into my 20 minutes, which is now 18 and a half minutes, so we're already behind. But I'm going to first do a little bit of work to set the stage, briefly share our conceptual framework, and I'm going to keep it very sort of high level. And then I want to share with you 7 insights for marketing that are derived directly from the work that we've been doing. So to get things started, just a little bit of history. The first stage of the internet I like to think of as the Internet of Information. That was Internet Phase 1, and that was really the web. And in terms of the research focus and even the marketing focus, it tended to be on online consumer experience. And if we think about what the catchphrase might have been, it's this famous New Yorker cartoon by Peter Steiner from the early 90s, which says on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Then fast forward, and now by 2013, we're pretty squarely into the social media phase of the internet. That's Internet Phase 2, and that's the internet of people, as I like to think about it. A lot of research on social media still going on, and the catchphrase there is, on the internet, everybody knows you're a dog. And now, just a few years later, we are now entering what I will argue is the third phase of the internet. And it's a really exciting phase. It's the Internet of Things. And I like to think of this as the post-social phase of the internet, where now we're thinking about consumer experiences of what I'll call the assemblage. This is an internet where devices, our interaction with devices, become much more important than our interactions with people. And the catchphrase here is, on the Internet of Things, nobody knows you're a fridge. Okay, so a little bit of humor there, but sort of set the stage for how I see things evolving. So just to make sure we're sort of on the same page here, what is the consumer Internet of Things? It's this collection of everyday objects in the physical world that are embedded with sensors and with actuators, and of course are connected to the internet, and they're connected to the cloud. And the thing that's really important about this is these devices communicate directly with other devices. So not only are they communicating with consumers, but in some of the ways I'm going to argue in a few minutes, some of these communications with the devices are more important than our communications with them. Okay, so if we think about, well, is this really a big deal? I'm here to tell you, I think the Internet of Things is going to be more revolutionary in terms of our lives and behavior than the internet itself was. And if we just look at some of the early numbers, you can see the Internet of Things is going to be huge. Samsung made an announcement that they are going to be 100% Internet of Things enabled. Every single product that they sell in just a few more years will be connected to the internet. So various estimates are between 25 and 50 billion connected devices in just 4 more years. There'll be about 250 million connected cars on the road in the next 4 to 5 years. There's been a lot of investment, and it's worth, very big numbers, 19 trillion perhaps in just another 5 years or so. So I don't think there's any argument that this is a massive opportunity, not just from a marketing perspective, but from a broader business perspective. But one of the things that's really been interesting to us is the current instantiation of the consumer Internet of Things is the smart home. And if you start to look at the smart home, you see there's a lot of hype, but there's not a lot of action. And in fact, there's an enormous adoption problem. And so I put some statistics up here, as you can see, not that many people own a connected device. And actually, by show of hands, how many people here in this room have at least one device? Okay, so you kind of proved my point. You're upscale, you're techie DIYers, you're overeducated, but for the most case, in the mass market, we don't see that. And in fact, a really kind of frightening study came out recently by Accenture, which suggested that the 2016 purchase intention rates for six different categories of some of the most popular connected devices, so smartwatches, smart home cameras, personal drones, things of that nature. I know I'm dying to get one. The purchase intent rates are really low. But even beyond that, the interest in purchasing one of those devices hasn't really changed in the last year. So something's going on. There are very low rates of adoption. On one hand, you have Samsung saying, we are going to have internet-enabled devices in every single product we sell, but consumers are saying, so we have a pretty significant situation here. So what are the barriers? I think there are three main barriers. One of them is awareness. Now, just last year, 80% of consumers suggested they didn't even know what the Internet of Things was, or if they did know, they weren't really sure what it was. I'm not too worried about the awareness problem. I'm a marketer, but it's picking up in the mainstream media. There's a lot of discussion about it. So I think that's going to catch up. But then we have two more significant problems. The second one has to do with price, insecurity, privacy, a loss of control. Consumers are kind of freaked out about what it might mean to bring these devices into the home. They're very expensive. There's some legitimate concerns about privacy and security. And there's also sort of this sense of loss of control. Remember when the HAL 9000 said, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that. And so there's this kind of sense that, are these devices going to take over and we're not going to be able to control them? But I think the third problem is the most important problem, and that's the problem of product value and performance. Many consumers just feel the value proposition is missing from these smart home, smart autonomous devices. Consumers don't really see the need for a smart home, and plus device use is pretty challenging. How do you install them? How do you get them to work together? They don't really work. I don't want to keep resetting the router. They don't work as advertised, so there's a lot of issues there. So one of the things we've been interested in studying in our center is how to crack this value code. And we'll argue that for smart home adoption to expand beyond sort of these niches of upscale consumers and these techie DIYers, we have to understand the value that the smart home offers to consumers. And one of the problems right now is that the current focus is on the individual products, the thermostats, the light bulbs, the refrigerators, the cameras, and the specific use cases. So for example, turn on the lights when I get home, or turn up, when it's dusk, set the lights to blue, and when it's midnight, turn off the lights, that sort of thing. But I'm going to argue today that the value is among the interaction among the devices, not among the individual devices themselves. And so we think that the smart home value is actually embedded in what the smart home identity means to consumers and what kind of experiences emerge with their interaction with those devices. And if you buy that, then we need a new framework for how to think about these things. And so let me take a few minutes to talk about that. One of the things we've noticed, and a lot of the work we do with companies suggests that at the beginning, consumers get one device, they get another device into the home, and then something really interesting starts to happen. Pretty soon, they want the devices to talk to each other. They want the devices to connect. They want some sort of interaction, and they want something more to happen than just what the individual devices can do themselves. And so what happens is the interaction among the devices becomes much more important than the single devices. And from that, consumer experience has the potential to emerge. And so when you think about what kind of framework would be useful to help us understand what can emerge from all of these interactions, we're drawing a lot of our framework for something called assemblage theory. I'm going to spend like a minute talking about it, but it's a really interesting theory from the neo-realist school of philosophy, and it basically helps us understand how all the interactions among entities can create a whole that is more than the sum of the parts. And let's take a look at one of the key ideas from this theory. The idea we're arguing is that the fundamental unit of analysis when we want to think about consumer experience in the smart home is not to think about the individual devices, but instead to think about the interactions among those devices, and we consider those in the context of what we call paired capacities. And so, for example, you can see here in this figure, there's a consumer might be interacting with the device. So if a consumer triggers a beacon when they enter a room, then maybe the Philips Hue turns on the light. Or similarly, if a motion sensor detects activity, then my security camera starts recording. So the big idea here is these interactions always happen together in this paired capacity, where the capacity of one device has the capacity to affect, and the other device has the capacity to be affected. And this simple concept turns out to be really important when we want to understand interaction. And the other thing I want to point out here is you have all these individual interaction events, and then you have this event stream over time, and these interactions together, from this, what can emerge are different kinds of experiences. So let's take one example of some of these interactions. Now, some of these interactions, so for example, in that slide I just showed you, they define what the marketing experts would call use cases. So for example, when the garage door opens or closes in my house, then turn the kitchen lights red for that moment. So kind of a red alert kind of use case. And that can lead to the use case that the industry would call safety and security. And use cases, in fact, dominate current smart home marketing. IBM 6 years ago introduced a white paper suggesting there would only be several use cases that would help define the industry. And then 5 years later, Lowe's Iris is marketing still on the basis of those use cases. SmartThings is still marketing on the basis of those use cases. And in fact, many marketers in the industry are saying, what will be that secret sauce combination of use cases that will get consumers to adopt? But we think that's the wrong question. Instead, if you think about it, use cases don't explain what can emerge. So you have all of this multitude of interactions constantly happening in a dynamic and heterogeneous way inside the home. And something really interesting emerges from that. In just this example, all these different things happening in the background, one experience could emerge, hey, my house really cares about me. It's really taking care of me. And so these experiences, we think, become really important in thinking about smart home marketing. And so just sort of a quick summary of our framework, we're going to argue that the smart home represents these interactions involving this exchange of these paired capacities. The capacity of one component to affect is always compared with the capacity of another component to be affected, and the smart home experience will emerge from all these paired capacities that are exercised in all of these ongoing interactions that are occurring in the smart home. And so it's this experience that turns out to be really important, not the individual devices themselves. And just to give you an example of what I'm talking about and why we think this is really important, both the home and the consumer can develop these emerging capacities. And from these emerging capacities, experience can emerge. So for example, the home has the capacity to track the behaviors of occupants, say for example with a smart camera. Then the home has the capacity to use smart behavior to suggest how things can change. So for example, maybe the home recognizes you're using too much energy and it might make a suggestion to turn the thermostat down. And then from this, what can emerge is the capacity of the home to actually be smart. So rather than marketing the home as smart, the home actually could develop the capacity to be smart through all of these interactions. At the same time, consumers have capacities. So the consumer could develop the capacity to feel this sort of tangible sense of presence in the home from all of these ongoing background interactions, some background, some explicit. The consumer might have the capacity to feel the home is alive to them. And then, I think this one's really interesting, the consumer might have the capacity to feel the home is with them even when they're away. And if any of you have second homes and have installed cameras and other devices in those homes, which you keep watch on through your smartphone, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because it's actually a sense of I'm there even when I'm not there. That's an emergent capacity, and we think those kinds of experiences are going to be really important. Okay, so I've got about 5 minutes left to share 7 important insights from my framework. So let me get to those. Okay, the first recommendation we have for marketers is to market from the bottom-up interactions, not just the top-down. What this means is we want to, rather than telling consumers what they should do in the smart home, we want consumers to create their own bottom-up interactions, and so from this, these different opportunities and experiences will emerge. In fact, saying that the smart home has 5 use cases is like saying the internet has 5 uses. And so we want to be really careful about making sure we're not doing this sort of only this top-down marketing. Number two, when we market the smart home, we want to think back to Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs first introduced and marketed the iPad, he didn't market it on the basis of use cases. Instead, he said, this is everything you already understand but more. He suggested it was magical. He suggested it was revolutionary. And if you remember when the iPad came out, a scant 6 years ago, there was a lot of, the name was mocked, people were really confused. What is it, a giant iPhone? And it was very not clear how to categorize it. And the smart home is like that early iPad at this point. We're really not sure what to do with it. We're really not sure what these interactions are going to produce, but we need the opportunity to think of it from those bottom-up interactions. Number three, marketers need to focus and encourage on habitual repetition. So this is repeating the same sort of interactions over and over again. When my wash is done, send me a text. When I run out of time, hit the Amazon dash button. When it's dusk, turn on the lights. When it's midnight, turn them off. Through these habitual interactions, consumers get into the habit of learning these interactions in the home. So we need to get these devices into the home as quickly as possible, and then we need to encourage these ongoing habits of use. Now, one of the things that's really going to be important is we want to focus on the ambient interactions. Now, remember I said at the beginning here that what I thought was going to be really important were going to be these device-to-device interactions, and that they might even be more important than the interactions that we as consumers have with our devices. And one of the reasons for this is because these ambient interactions, these interactions going on in the background on a regular basis that we aren't even involved in because they're autonomous, those are the kind of interactions that help build trust. And then we can start to feel that the house can be reliably do what we programmed it to do. And that's going to be really important as we start to think about marketing this going forward so that consumers can generate these feelings of trust. Now, it might seem a little bit contradictory, but at the same time that we're trying to encourage this habitual repetition to generate these consistent sets of interactions, we also need to do a little bit of shaking up. Don't have time to talk about this whole framework we've developed here, but the basic idea, what I'm talking about here, is these are these habitual interactions and routine use we want to stimulate. But consumers have the natural tendency to get bored, particularly as these simple devices, we sort of begin to master them and figure out how to use them. And so at the same time, marketers have to destabilize to keep consumers interested as the environment gets more complex. And that can be done through notifications and add-ons and software updates and new products and things of that nature to keep that market developing. My sixth recommendation, insight derived from our analysis, is that marketers need to pay attention to emergent individual smart home identities. And in other words, what's happening in these individual homes as consumers are interacting with all of these different devices. And the reason they need to do this is because what's happening in any one individual home isn't going to be that important, because from our theory, it's very clear that interactions in homes are going to sort of tend and clump toward interesting patterns, and it's those patterns we need to be aware of so that we can see what the themes are in use. Now, the marketers out there will recognize those clumps and patterns. Those are emergent market segments. And though I won't have time to talk about it today, there's a lot of interesting analytic work we're also doing, looking at these event streams to deduce what those patterns actually look like in the millions of interactions that we have from this kind of IoT event stream data. My final recommendation, maybe a little controversial, I believe that there's going to be something more that emerges that's going to trump privacy. And if we think about that, it's possible that there will be something will happen in the home that will make consumers feel that the benefits are so great, it's worth trading off their privacy for. And if we start to think what that might be, I think personalization is going to play a very large role in that. As these devices and these interactions gain more information about who we are from our using them, and they use that information to influence subsequent behaviors, we can imagine a situation where we'll say, hey, this is pretty great. And in fact, early evidence trends from the marketing trenches suggest consumers really like this personalization because they recognize the benefits of the smart home being able to meet its needs. Let me just give you 2 examples to suggest how this would work. Imagine a home that does a neighborhood of homes that decides to be networked. So they put the kids on tags, they put the pets on tags, and then it's possible with networking in the homes as well for everybody to keep track of where their kids are, how late they're staying at the park, hey, it's Johnny, it's time to come home for dinner, where spot, and that sort of thing. And when you think about whether consumers would be willing to give up what is actually an enormous amount of privacy in exchange for the benefits of that networking, we think they will. Another example from connected cars, will consumers be willing to give up information about their location, sharing it with other cars, information about their speed, their travels, and so on, in exchange, say, for reduced insurance premiums? You bet they will. And so when we think about these opportunities, it's going to be very important for us to pay attention to what kind of experiences emerge and where consumers see those benefits. And with that, I'll wrap up. The challenge for marketers, sort of the takeaways here, the smart home is going to be much more than the sum of its parts. It's not just the individual devices, it's actually, I think, going to be more fruitful to think about it as a set of complex interactions between people and between these newly smart autonomous objects, which will interact in ways that I predict will be revolutionary for consumer behavior and for marketing. And so we want to emphasize the assemblages from which all these experiences emerge, not these individual devices. And so the most important job we have right now is to get these devices into as many homes as possible, as quickly as possible, because what we need to focus on are the interactions and what will emerge. And from that, we will have the tools and the strategies available to help develop expanded patterns of use and deeper adoption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, always a pleasure to hear you speak, so informative and so thought-provoking. I'm sure the audience will have a bunch of questions. I have a quick question. Among all the areas that you've invested in, where do you see the greatest potential in the short run for these smart home applications?
I think that's a really great question, and I actually think it's not these smart home devices. So I don't think it's the light bulbs and the Nest thermostats, although they're coming. It's cars. It's connected cars. It's very clear these cars are already smart, and they're going to be autonomously smart within 5 years. And anybody who goes out to buy a car, it's going to be a smart car. And through those experiences, oh, gee, this is pretty great. What if my home did stuff like this? So we think that's what's going to drive smart home adoption.
Thank you very much. All right, we have time for questions. Yes, over there in the back, the lady in the back. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Just a quick question. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the trajectory of the smart office space. We're looking at work-life balance. We're looking at the integration of office environments and home environments. So what do you see as the trajectory for office environments getting smart?
I think it will probably happen a lot quicker than smart home environments because there will be potential cost savings with lighting and thermostats, and that would be the first wave, and then I think we'll see it go from there. And just in general, the B2B space in Internet of Things is like a rocket, where we're seeing the stall is on the consumer side.
I'd like your thoughts on something you just touched on. One of the most exciting technologies, I think, is what Amazon is doing with Dash, but it's not really a thing, it's an operating system. They're planning to integrate it with Echo and all that. Mm-hmm. The whole idea basically is really automated replenishment, right? So it could be that you see you're low on toilet paper, you just say that, and it appears on your doorstep because Amazon already has your credit card and everything else. It could even be that sensors are built into the product, into the shelf, or whatever. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are about, how that might transform marketing, CPG, shopping marketing.
Okay. Actually, I'll sort of answer that in a broader way. My opinion of Amazon Echo, which many people call Alexa, which itself is kind of interesting because we're already beginning to anthropomorphize that device and that experience, is that that's the stealth entry into consumer IoT. And one of the reasons I think that's going to be very significant is because because it's using voice. And so if you think back to my comments about personalization, one way personalization can really take off is through voice, because we each have unique voices. And so one of the problems right now in the smart home is each of us would need our own app to control the devices. But if we're talking to a device, which then can control those devices, and we each are identifiable by our unique voices, then it's a possibility for the entire home to get involved in that experience. So I think actually the impact of Echo, what I like to call Amazon, Alexa now, will go way beyond CPG, but you're right, it's, you know, why not just say, hey, reorder, you know, that laundry detergent, the dishwashing liquid, what have you, and I can just tell her, as opposed to even going to the computer. So I think we're going to be in for a wild ride.
The lady here had a question on this side.
Hi. As you think about the opportunity, not just in the U.S. but also globally, to what extent are you looking at the influence of government and regulations? I'm thinking about the Apple lawsuit, but also even in Europe on a day-to-day basis, much stricter rules about privacy and access to consumer data.
Okay, great question. Of course, I'm in DC, and there's a lot of activity, a lot of policy meetings, a lot of conferences on precisely those issues. And most of the action right now is around cars. And so a lot of the activity on where we need to regulate, and whether we need to regulate, and what we need to regulate, and what we have to protect, and what we have to look out for, well, not stifling innovation, tends to be focused in the transportation sector right now. It's interesting, though, the FTC is taking an interesting position that perhaps we have to be very careful about what data we collect, because we don't want to collect any more than we really need. And so I think that's going to put us at odds with what many of these innovations have available. So I don't think it's even a risky prediction that there's going to be some conflict and clashes as we start to see larger adoption. And we start to collect these data and analyze these data.
One last question, please.
Some of the things that have gotten publicity that show that a certain amount of care has to happen with the baby monitors that have allowed people to take a peek into your house.
Sure.
And also the cars that suddenly can be controlled by someone other than the occupant. So I would think that there might be some consumer hesitation to the extent that those things have become aware.
I think that's absolutely correct. I'm sorry.
And to continue with that, I have read or heard that actually there's probably going to be a lot more places in industry for IoT to take place, many more types of devices. And so when people are in the workplace, and certainly some of those uses are not going to be that obvious to every worker where they are, but I would think that people might gain some more trust and awareness of the power of these devices through their workplace.
Those are great comments. You're right. I'll just add my own to the security issue. You know, you can weaponize, they've been a demonstration at one of the hacker conferences, you can weaponize a coffee pot and effectively, through the internet and effectively blow up the kitchen. So there are definitely lots of, security issues. Many have made the news, a lot more have not. But the point you raise about people's experiences, that gets back to the point I raised about ambient interactions. And marketers needing to make these interactions visual or visualizable, for example, through dashboards or things like that. That will also be important in the workplace, because many of them are ambient, happening behind the scene or device to device. Even in our cars, you have no idea how smart your cars really are. And as consumers become exposed to that, they will start to gain more familiarity and go, oh, this could be pretty cool. What do I have to do to get that? So that's how I see the trajectory of the adoption happening, notwithstanding the significant security concerns.
Okay, thank you very much, Donna.
Thank you.
So now we'll be moving into 1 o'clock. You can cancel that. Now let me turn the stage back to David, who's going to be introducing our next speaker.
Thank you, Michelle. Fantastic. So I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker. Actually spoke about Vikram Somaya 2 years ago at Brite, when I was talking about the power of data in the network world, and talked about his work at a previous company. He was leading an amazing initiative at the Weather Company, which owns the Weather Channel, and more recently split up and sold its entire data business to IBM. But the weather company was really a fascinating example, and I talk about them in my book, of a business that was using data, as I said before, for operational purposes, and started to realize the incredible potential for value creation out of all this weather data. So Vikram has now moved on to another business that also has a lot of data and is trying to look at the value of it, how do you unlock more value out of all this data that you have. And it's a business that's very much looking at the experience of live media. We talked about a lot of our changing media habits, how we binge watch now on Netflix, we're not watching shows at the same time as each other. So if you roll back the clock 10 years ago, what percentage of live media do you think would have been taken up by sports? Any guesses? Random guess? 10%? Not bad, it was actually 14%. Guess what percentage of live media, live television today is sports? 93%. So, in a way, you could say the future of live media, what is still very much there is a live media experience, but it is increasingly completely dominated by sports. And that opens up all kinds of possibilities for what data related to these experiences of sports can afford for all kinds of new value creation. So kudos to Disney and the ESPN team for bringing on board Vikram Somaiya. He's now the global data officer for ESPN. He's going to talk to us about some of the amazing things that they're thinking about, how you use the data around this live experience. And actually, this is very exciting, we don't usually have this, he's going to talk about new products that are coming out right now. This is the very first time ESPN has talked about them at all. Just starting to go live with advertisers and brand partners. So a very exciting, very forward-looking presentation on how ESPN in the future is live. Vikram.
The media merchant of Venice, Act 1, Scene 3. Senior marketer, many a time enough upon the Rialto, you have rated me for my profits and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug. For sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. You call me sports fan, publisher, dog, and spit upon my ESPN gabardine, and all for the use of that which is mine own. Don't you then? You come to me and you say, shut up! We would have consumers. You say so. You that had put your rib upon my beard and spurn me as you'd spurn a stranger girl of your threshold. Consumers is your suit. What shall I say to you? Should I not say, half a dog consumers? Is it possible that a small sports company can lend you thus many impressions? Or should I bend low, and in abundance fee, with bated breath and whispering humbleness say this, fair sir, you spit on me Wednesday last, you spurred me such a day, another time you called me dog, and for these courtesies, I will bring you 300 million consumers. See. So thank you for having me. I always think it's interesting to start in a way that's unexpected. As David mentioned, I've been through a couple of different types of work in my career. I started out in an agency, then spent about 12 years in a variety of startups, working with data analytics, primarily in the media and the internet, companies that some of you might know, like Omniture and Brite. And then most recently, I followed the axiom of local news and worked for Reuters, the news organization, then worked for the weather company, which is weather, and now, of course, I'm at ESPN, so making sure I got the trifecta of news, weather, and sports under my belt. As David mentioned, when I was at the weather company, a lot of what we were looking at was, we were in a world now where, and I think somebody earlier this afternoon mentioned this, technology is ubiquitous. And so what we wanted to think about was, when we were coming up with new ways to use technology and data to activate against marketing within these large media corporations, I didn't want to talk about technology. Everything I built and the teams we brought in were about figuring out how to build the things that we needed to. But what we really wanted to think about was, how do we tell these stories in a more compelling way? And as David mentioned in his book, with Weather Effects, the product that I built at the weather company, we were really looking at the power of the environment on how consumers behave. So when I came to ESPN 9 months ago, there was a lot for me to internalize. ESPN, as was mentioned earlier, is part of the Disney organization. It has a vast amount of information it has been gathering for a very, very long time now. As David mentioned, however, though, there is a movement in media that is forcing us to think a very particular way about what our strengths are. And so what we came up with was a product that actually went live this morning with our first client. Unfortunately, I can't talk about who it is just yet, but as you internalize and digest more and more sports media, I think you'll start to see what I'm about to talk about in just a few minutes as being a more and more ubiquitous part of how you internalize commercial content through sports networks. So the product that we're putting out is part of a larger suite of products that we're umbrellaing under ESPN Live. And the notion of live manifests for us in a variety of different ways. There were three philosophical underpinnings to the way we thought about how we want to build a data infrastructure and a marketing infrastructure within ESPN that would be unique. The first actually references the statistic that David just mentioned. And it talks about sports' non-stop march towards live. Streaming, time shifting. If you look at any other media organization, certainly any large media organization, and certainly any media organization that lives in the multi-channel universe, they have been time shifted pretty quick. We are not. At ESPN, those numbers have stayed very, very high, and we're about 95, 96% now. In the next 10 to 15 years, don't expect to go down more than a couple of percentage points. Whereas if you're in any other form of media, you're seeing significant change in how people are actually internalizing content. That allows us to do something that is tied to a live timeline, and that's important, and I'll talk about why in just a second. The second piece is the sports fan is now internalizing sports information from a vast variety of sources. Certainly from the multi-channel world and from linear, where in the US we are a dominant force. In the digital world, where globally we are a dominant force. And then friends, social, a variety of other things and systems and platforms that are pushing out stats, news, profiles, documentaries, and live events. The last piece that's become really, really interesting to us is what we have in-house. For the last 10 years, ESPN has been gathering information about our sports fans' allegiances. Why is that important? We found out at very, very granular levels what sports they're interested in, what teams they're interested in, and where they're from. And we've been gathering that and mapping it to all of the content that they begin to consume across all of our sites. As a marketer, ESPN has had an absolutely outsized impact on how marketing is conducted through the media ecosystem. We do a phenomenal amount of work with a phenomenal amount of clients, and largely it has been in the linear world, with the digital business now acquiring steam at a pretty heady rate of speed. There are other things that we're looking at, of course, VR and a whole host of other worlds that we want to enter. But the last thing that became important to us was, if the first live was sports, and the second live was our fans, the third live became location. Understanding who you were and where you were and what your allegiances were began to help us understand how you were going to behave. And that's something that has always fascinated me. Looking around at the marketing ecosystem today, and as part of companies like Bluecar and others, I helped create sort of the third-party commodified data world in terms of data you can access to understand how to deliver messaging against particular consumer groups. They're fairly static, whether it's demographics or psychographics. Knowing that I'm Indian and I make over $100,000 a year and I live in New York doesn't tell you a whole lot about what to say to me right now. So we said, what should we be looking at to understand how to better speak to these consumers in market in a way that will have a much, much greater level of impact? And so we looked at emotion. Sports amplifies emotion all the time. In sport, and you'll see some of the pictures that come up behind me, none of them are actually pictures of sports players. What they are is pictures of sports fans reacting. They're always reacting. They're reacting positively, they're reacting negatively, and there's a huge amount of nuance that we're beginning to dig into as we understand what that looks like. There's a couple of really interesting things, though, about the way that they react. Very often, It transcends all the typical segmentation boundaries that a lot of marketers have been locked in by. It transcends demographics and psychographics, race, behavior. And all it links to is this notion that we as a communal force are reacting to something that is happening in real time. And obviously that happens in the stadiums and on the fields, but it actually happens now through this distributed digital world all over the place. And allowing that to then manifest with social signal allows it to become even more amplified. For those of you who have kept your eye on this, ESPN is represented on pretty much every social channel there is. I noticed earlier there was a piece that came up about Snapchat. We were one of the founding publishers in the Discover platform. We like to be where people are going because we understand that we have one very huge weapon in this race. We own a lot of sports rights. And we pay for them, and we make a lot of money on them. Because they allow us to do things with a window that nobody else can. And so we can take our time to figure out which things work and which things do not. So we came up with these three core concepts, and we said we want to do something with emotion. What do we do? So what we began to do was to create two sets of taxonomies. One was every single sports event that drives some form of emotional response. And the easiest way to pick a taxonomy that will make sense for you is in-game, right? We are televising a ton of games. ESPN actually produces close to 5,000 live events a year, 5,000. And in the digital world, we actually report on pretty much everything else. So we are constantly putting out information, scores, touchdowns, tries, injuries, player departures, coach departures, things that matter today, in manage the game. And I will tell you guys a secret. I am not an American sports fan. So when I first came to ESPN, I came in as a little bit of a stranger. I'm a fan of sport, just not American sport, even though I went to college here. I also went to an Ivy League school, and for the first time since 1962, we're going to go to the big dance, which is super exciting. It does tell you generally how Yale does with sport. And so when I came here and sort of looked at abstractly how we should speak to people, the power of this suggestion was monumental. So we said, what does that mean and how does that manifest in the platforms that we actually work with? And we have obviously a huge set of channels across linear. We have a huge presence in digital, in mobile, and in mobile app with our ESPN and Watch ESPN applications. And then there are a whole host of other distributed platforms where we put out content. So we said, what do we want to do? We built out this emotional taxonomy pretty significantly. And we looked at things, as you would imagine, like victory, defeat, hope, disappointment, a sense of history, challenge, teamwork, discipline, commitment, disgust, horror. They go on and on. And what was interesting is in the last 6 months, we have gone out quietly to a whole host of our best clients across a variety of different kinds of categories. And we did that very deliberately. Historically, when I built systems like this, they've had obvious applications for certain verticals. Weather has obvious applications for retail. What we were doing with emotion actually had applications for everything. And as we went out and spoke to our clients, whether they were in insurance, or in autos, or in retail, or in FMCG, or in CPG, there was a whole series of responses to what we were proposing, which was a framework that said there are 3 things that need to happen. You need to sit down with us and pick all the events that you think are interesting, and then figure out what we want to tap into, both on the nose and then more deeply. And some of these messages are, when I say on the nose, I mean on the nose. Something just happened, and we're putting out our brand and surrounding it. And what's interesting about it is where we can, we are talking about your team. If we own the rights, with their colors and names. If not, referencing the things that just happened. So anyone who's been kind of in the real-time messaging universe lately knows that this is hot, right? This outcome-based advertising, where you're actually doing something in real time and talking to people about things that they care about in a way that is engaging, is something that will work. It doesn't, not everyone can do it. And that's what was fascinating to us with sports. we had a completely non-exhaustible, non-perishable inventory of events that we could predict. We have a 250-person team at ESPN called Stats and Information. Not the best name. That's what they do. It's actually one of the hardest jobs to get at ESPN. In order to get it, you have to have a vast compendium of knowledge about sports in your head in the interview. And we asked them to actually break down just one category, all these events. And we just looked at this particular case, the NFL football game, and they came back to us with 700 categorizable events. Not all of them are usable, as you would imagine. One of them was literally head coach has to leave because of problems. So some of them we could use, some of them we could not. But there is a vast amount of predictability to what could happen. And we have now had clients sit down with us and map these stories for us, much the same way they've done in social in some ways, where essentially when something happens, we can actually put out absolutely custom creative. Very often they tap into initiatives that the clients have already been excited about. And in almost every case, these clients are close partners of ours. They're working with us on a variety of different things. But historically, a vast proportion, a vast percentage of ESPN's media has been linked to sponsored content. Right? So, in essence, we are working around events. You're helping to put your media around the US Open or college football. But in this particular case, we are doing things that skip from sport to sport. Because if you are interested in tennis, that's where we're going to have the most impact. And so what the system does in a way that has never been done before at ESPN is by skipping around between sports and saying, what will have the most impact in terms of creating the two kinds of messages that I would reference. One, again, is these very on-the-nose things, where something good happens, how do we tap into that? Something bad happens, how do we tap into that? I won't go too deep into some of the emotional modeling we're doing, but there are simple and obvious things like mood repair, for example. When a negative thing happens, we're actually tapping into notions of soothing. Right? How do we talk to them through the lens of something that they care about in a way that will help them open up? And authenticity becomes really important here. So again, pushing out a message that doesn't seem right never works. You have to work very closely with your marketer partners to really do this right. And from our point of view, that creates an ecosystem change that is vital for us. Even with these large clients who work with us on sponsorships, one of the things that we're always curious about is how can we get deeper, how can we better understand your business? And in order to use this system, we have to work really close together. And that has created a lot of really interesting opportunities for us. As we begin to better understand, we've always known that sports drives marketing. It's just one of those things that does. And a lot of it we believed tapped into these notions of heightened emotional response and heightened moments of openness. But now we're beginning to understand exactly when and why that happens. And that is the science of it. The art of it is the other piece of optimization we're doing, which is the vast amount of work that we're putting into creating the right kinds of creative stories. ESPN's always been very, very good with deep integrations. And sport, again, is one of these very rare places where actually bringing in commerce is an accepted part of how people relate to these events. The orange of Home Depot and college football have been linked together for 14 years. It wouldn't feel quite the same if they weren't there. And so it allows us to begin to experiment with new ways of talking to folks that is based on science, but is related to this notion of hooking the heart in a very fundamental way that's very, very true to sport. And that allows us then to start beginning to do things in linear which we haven't done before. And there are two ways that we're beginning to talk about how we work with that. One begins to deal with addressability, which is coming soon. And I won't get too deep into that. But some are more obvious ways to actually connect with how people actually perceive what's happening on television. The first is actually working with what's happening with dynamic insertion into our actual live experience. So when you see billboards in a sporting arena or in one of our studio shows, in the near future, those billboards will be dynamic, powered by the same data engine that I just talked about powering our digital messaging. So the things that happen during that day would actually influence how the reality of the situation you're in is affected. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the yellow line in football, now we have AR banners coming down showing you player names. Those don't really exist in there. Just those who haven't figured it out yet, right? There is an actual team that's doing it, and they're rendering it on the fly out there in the field. So as players move, the system re-renders everything so that it looks like it's existing in real space. There is a lot we can do there. The second notion is, and this is something that we've already pushed live with some clients, we're actually changing 30-second spots in the control room based on what's actually happening in games. So our marketer partners are providing us with effectively dynamic, creative, linear programming for our standard commercial ad spots, and we're beginning to work through that. And that's literally just the tip of the iceberg. When we think about it in stadium, in car, we have a radio network, and again, we have very, very deep connectivity into the world of distributed platforms, if you will. Pretty much all of them have to come to work with us if they want to be in sport. And that is one of the advantages of being a 600-pound gorilla in a space that people are looking at very, very carefully. So with 15 seconds left on the clock, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd love to take them.
Thank you, Vikram. Fascinating. So, I'm thinking about the kind of emotional responses that I may be having, and what kind of virtual presence will be appearing on the field with the next Super Bowl next year. One just quick follow-up question: What is your sport that you're passionate about?
Cycling, rugby. I don't actually watch cricket, which terrifies all of and Formula One. Yeah, so
Formula One.
It's a whole bunch of courses that we actually don't have rights for, which is terrifying.
Terrifying. Well, you can work in the acquisition department. Let's get a question from down front.
Thank you very much, Francisco Guzman, University of Texas.
Yep.
I find the segmentation that you have implemented fascinating. We always talk about getting away from the scripted and going to the gateway. Barrels is probably more insightful than segmentation.
Yep.
How do you implement it? How do you,
so let's talk a little bit about that. I did spend a lot of time on measurements, right? And that has been to some degree the great boogeyman of marketing, especially in the linear world. So ESPN has historically been huge at the top of the funnel. Right? I mean, we are a big reach engine that the likes of which has never been seen in media before. What we're doing for the first time is beginning to go deeper into consideration and all the way into actually pushing volume. And we're linking that back in a whole variety of ways, in ways that are now available, whether it's companies like Datalogix or Nielsen Catalina, or actually doing differentiated control tests with sales data involved. We're actually looking at performance measurement. And so part of it is abstractly understanding what works and what doesn't work. And we have a whole bunch of control testing to do that. Part of it is maybe we don't care. Is it working to drive the metrics that our marketers care about? And so both those learnings have to happen kind of at the same time. And the one other big piece that I think that the company was quick to adopt and has done in various other places around the company was test and learn with our marketer clients was relatively new. And so we're doing a lot of work where we're testing a whole bunch of hypotheses, as we should. And some will work out, some will not. There are multiple taxonomy types that we're testing, some which might work out, some which might not. And we have actually gone to our clients and said, you're going to pay for something which may not work, but we'll teach you about what will.
Yeah.
And I think as marketers, we need to do that more and more often.
And I think it's a great point, as you mentioned backstage and also on here, that you're launching these new products with a wide range of categories.
That's right.
So even if you can only have to start maybe a couple companies in each category, not only because you can, as you said, because sports data, this kind of emotional impact can have resonance across a lot of categories, but for the learning, it's a great opportunity for you to learn much more very rapidly about this taxonomies and what the impacts are.
Yeah, and really for the first 6 months to a year, we think that we're going to be in a huge learning phase.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, we get to do that with clients who support us, which is fantastic.
Terrific. Other question? Back on the side, yes.
My name is Peter Crosby with a company called .sub. We translate video into any language.
Yeah.
I'd love to understand, how do you use language in a data stream for personalization?
Good question. So I think that has implications both domestically and obviously we have a global presence. So NLP, semantics, there's a lot to be done there, both in terms of a data input So beginning to understand how we can use notions of language to influence, it's just a simple data input where we're doing NLP on closed captioning to understand what's happening in the game, right? That's the simplest version. But then beginning to understand how we can change up how to speak to our marketer clients, how to speak to their consumers in a variety of different ways, that will be really interesting over time as well. If we can map that to our taxonomies in a way that then becomes causative and certainly becomes repeatable, we're all about scale. We make a lot of money through scale. I don't like doing things small. So making sure that we can use technologies like that to drive that notion, I think will be really interesting over time as well. So both that and computer vision, there are a bunch of different areas of science, I think, which will serve us very well in understanding those pieces. I'd be interested to explore more.
One more question. Yes.
Hi, Joseph McElroy, Algorhythm Media. You mentioned cross-segment, finding different emotional responses, and then finding ways that, for example, you said something soothing.
Yeah.
But there seems to be, there would be different kinds of responses that would work for different types of people. And
Yep.
are you doing work in that kind of?
Yeah, no. There's a ton more than just that. Obviously, part of my problem here is I can't give away the secret sauce completely. So there's a whole host of nuance to that piece of the business, and all of it gets tested in the digital world at a personal level. I mean, I think everyone has already, if you haven't discussed already, I'm sure right, you guys will be talking about email marketing, which has come up before. We've moved beyond platforms and cookies and idea phase to some degree, right? And part of it is we now can, to some degree, test what works for individual folks. We think there'll be a lot of nuance in that, and the advent of commercially viable big data allows us to create, very specific models, which allows us to do a lot of testing. In the end, it all goes back to that. We're going to go with what works.
So in the near future, I may be getting a different marketing experience as I'm streaming my game from ESPN. But
You're
the
doing
other
that today,
person who's rooting for the different team in the exact same, maybe even in the same household.
I think over time that'll be really, really interesting. Again, it all depends on what people are willing to trade for convenience and for value. And as Don knows, Disney's a company that is very careful with privacy, and so we want to be in a situation where we respect that and give them back something that they appreciate.
Terrific. Well, really looking forward to seeing what comes next. Thank you so much, Victor.